Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Seth Bringman with Fair Fight Action. We have a wonderful group of leaders who have fought for voting rights in Georgia for a long time on with us today. I'd like to welcome all of the state and national reporters. Obviously, we have the center of the universe is once again in Georgia, and we want to offer our thoughts on the latest developments. I will turn it over to my boss, Lauren Growargo, CEO of Fair Fight Action.
Thank you so much, Seth. And I saw a note in the chat. Yes, this is an on-the-record briefing. I'm so thrilled to be here with James Woodall and Nancy Abudu. All of us in our organizations on our own and together are fighting for the right to vote in Georgia. And it's a really remarkable Monday here after Easter Sunday that over the weekend, the governor of our state stood up at a press conference and celebrated losing jobs and revenue and income for our state with the MLB All-Star Game leaving, blaming Stacey Abrams for something that he caused. Brian Kemp championed and signed in a locked room a precision voter suppression bill that was instigated by an insurrection and the lie of voter fraud. Let's put this in context. Georgia is at the bottom. It's actually been number 50 or in the bottom 5 of coronavirus vaccination rates. We have rejected billions of dollars to expand Medicaid, and this governor's let hospitals close in a pandemic. And now here he is beating his chest about pride on a voter suppression bill that will make it harder for his fellow American citizens to vote and has lost jobs due to it. This is nobody's fault but his own. And let's be clear, because since that Saturday press conference, there have been multiple analyses from the New York Times to local reporters in Atlanta, creating false equivalencies between the pro and anti-voter suppression bill sides and misunderstanding or misconstruing what this bill is. Voter suppression and the Jim Crow 2.0 we're living through doesn't look like the last version. But similarly, it is coded and racist all the same. So I'm gonna give one example and my colleagues here are gonna dive into more. Just look at the out of precinct provisional ballot voting ban of the bill. I think it's a great example of what this bill is. Oh, you say that's not a lot of voters who vote provisionally. Joe Biden won the state of Georgia by 11,700 votes. That's about the same number of provisional ballots that were in the state. The majority of those provisional ballots were folks who accidentally voted in the wrong precinct. Would you deny your fellow American their ability to have their vote count because they showed up at the wrong location to vote for president? Those votes got counted and they broke for Joe Biden by 64%. So this is what I mean by precision, by the limitation on out of precinct voting and the mechanics on how they did it is the difference between winning and losing close races. And it's the difference between Republican and Democratic voters. And so this is an example of what precision voter suppression targeting looks like and why they're going after these sorts of actions. On top of the criminalization of this bill, the support and encouragement for mass challenges of voters, all of these provisions are meant to intimidate voters, and it's a gift that they're giving to far-right extremist groups like True the Vote and others who would strip 360,000 Georgians of the right to vote right before the January runoff if they had their way in a race that was won by 90,000 votes. So that's what precision means, and that's what's in this bill. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our tremendous NAACP Georgia Conference President, Reverend James Woodall, to share more remarks.
Thank you, Lauren, and to you all, good afternoon. I first want to start by just saying that there is no equivalence here. This is an assault against democracy itself. This includes rural voters, Black voters, Democratic voters, Republican voters. This will impact all of Georgians. And we need to be very, very careful about the narrative that is being pushed, because just 5 months ago, there was over 360,000 people's voter registration statuses that was challenged. And of those 360,000, nearly 360,000, about less than 100 of them were actually qualified as being duly challenged and thus removed from the voting rolls, causing confusion. This is in no way, shape, or form an attempt to talk about voter ID. This is way much deeper than that. This is an attempt by Republicans in the Georgia General Assembly of not only taking power away from local boards of election, taking power away from the state election board, which is duly elected, taking power away from Georgia voters to be able to decide what happens in public policy. We talked about the MLB and there's possibility of $100 million being lost in revenue from that. But nobody talks about the public policy decisions of the Republican leadership, which is costing millions upon millions of dollars in lost revenue for not expanding Medicaid. That is the difference between 11,000 voters and 50,000 voters being able to participate in this election. And so talking about specific provisions of this legislation is deeper, again, than photo ID. We have opportunities for Republicans to be able to appoint a quote unquote nonpartisan appointee to head the state election board when currently under Georgia's Constitution. That should be the Georgia Secretary of State, who's duly elected by the entire constituency here in Georgia. Or you're looking at the prohibition of third-party funding. About a dozen or so counties apply for and receive third-party funding to help with election administration. Under this new Jim Crow 2.0 law, that is now prohibited from local counties being able to fund themselves, as well as secure additional funding when the gaps are presented and additional funding is necessary. Or you talk about the decrease in the amount of the time from a runoff from 9 weeks to 28 days. Counties during the the legislative process said that that was just not enough time to administer elections in a safe, secure, and accessible manner. So we talk again about voter confidence, and we must ask the question, who are we concerned about, or rather who the Republicans are concerned about when it comes to voter confidence? And lastly, I'll lift up this. The bill's sponsor, Chairman Barry Fleming, literally not even a week before the legislative session began, hosted several, not just one, but several hearings that gave space for disinformation, lies, conspiracy theories that literally cost officers their lives at the U.S. Capitol. And so we talk about the context of why this legislation has been presented. We had dozens upon dozens of bills presented, and only about 5 or 6 of them were ever heard into a hearing. And of those 5, 2 of them ultimately made it to the House and the Senate, which after crossover day, and both of them had some kind of addition by Chairman Barry Fleming, who was directly responsible for opining an article in the AJC talking about, the election was stolen and voter fraud and all those kind of things. This is the context for this legislation. And to ignore that would be not only disingenuous, but very dangerous. And so we have to be very, very careful that when we're writing analysis that does not have that kind of nuance and context, that we make space for the legitimizing of the kind of disinformation that we continue to see impact our communities day in and day out. The last thing I'll say is this. This is not an attempt to overthrow millions upon millions of voters. This is a very surgical, precise act that's seeking to take away just the smallest margin of error so that they can decide through the penning of legislation who wins and who loses elections. That is the most dangerous provision of all of this. And so without that nuance and context, again, I believe that we are doing ourselves an injustice to be able to talk really and really accurately about what impact this legislation is going to have. Because it's deeper than voter ID, it's deeper than just line warming and giving people water at the polls. This is about people being able to participate in democracy. And we're going to continue to stand against it. If it's Democrats doing it, Republicans doing it, but right now we see exactly who's doing it. We're going to call them out.
Thank you so much, James. I'm now pleased to introduce Nancy Abudu, who's the Deputy Legal Director of the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, James, Reverend Woodall, for your comments as well. I just really want to appreciate Lauren's beginning and terms of putting this in context, that the right to vote is not just about casting a ballot. It's what that ballot means. It's what your voice is standing up for. And it's the issues, as Lauren mentioned, about our economy. The fact that you have so many Georgians who are economically struggling as we make our way out of this pandemic. It's about our health crisis, the crisis of our healthcare system here in Georgia, and the fact that people are exercising their right to vote in a way to influence those policy decisions. And now we have a law like Georgia Senate Bill 202 that completely silences so many of Georgians when it comes to encouraging that kind of political participation. I want to highlight that this effort, as the legislators in support of this bill have indicated, to stop voter fraud, as has been stated already, is just creating more confusion and is the big lie for sure. And in fact, I want to say that, when we talk about voter fraud, about the misrepresentation of individuals or of information to individuals that negatively influences their ability to participate, that is fraud. So when you have a bill like Georgia Senate Bill 202 that is supposed to arguably respond to fraud, what it's actually doing is encouraging the intimidation and unlawful prosecution of voters simply to present or manufacture evidence to support the lie that, again, is used to perpetuate these kinds of laws. We think the hotline provision, for example, in this bill is really just another mechanism to further that kind of intimidation and prosecution. And we know from history that third-party registration organizations, like our nonpartisan clients in the lawsuit that we filed to challenge this bill, are often the targets of those kind of state efforts to, again, manufacture this idea of voter fraud. So last week, the Southern Poverty Law Center, along with our partners at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund and the ACLU, filed a lawsuit on behalf of nonpartisan organizations, because I think it speaks to what Reverend Woodall said, that we are less concerned about whether or not Republicans or Democrats are bringing these kinds of regressive bills, even though we know in this case who the real actors are. But we're focused on making sure that all voters are able to exercise their right to vote, regardless of who they end up voting for. That is the voice, that is the fundamental right that our lawsuit seeks to protect. And so we're just really concerned about the unconstitutional behavior, the complete overreach that the state is exercising through this law. And that is why we've raised claims under the federal US Constitution in terms of making sure that all voters, but especially voters of color, are able to enjoy equal protection. That's why we have invoked sections of the Voting Rights Act that pertain and protect communities of color in particular. And that's why we will continue to use all of the tools available to us, but especially in this case, litigation. So I thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. So the larger context here, as James and Nancy have pointed out, is on what a governor's priorities are and what the response was to historic turnout by Asian American voters, by Black voters, by Latino voters, by young voters, by rural South Georgia voters. The response to that historic turnout and a partisan change of power was this massive voter suppression omnibus bill. And not just in Georgia, this is a national Republican playbook. We're seeing similar bills rolled out in Texas, Arizona, Michigan, and state after state after state. That the response to a historic turnout election, coming on the heels of the Trump voter fraud conspiracy lie operation that they built and funded, is this backlash to the right to vote. And so let's be clear. Verified Action, along with our allies, we're calling for corporate citizens to step their game up. This is not just for advocates like those of us on the call. This is for all of us who care about our democracy and the democratic norms that are not theoretically threatened. They are absolutely under attack. We saw from the attack on the Capitol, to the attack on elections workers in Fulton County, to the attack on state legislators who dare spoke up against voter fraud. Our democracy is under attack. And so we have been clear that corporate actors need to speak up against these bills. We're happy to welcome them late, but they got to get in the game before the bills are passed, like we've seen American Airlines and many other companies speaking up now against the Texas bills. We're really grateful that Delta and Coke got in the game, though they got in late, but that coming and bringing their voice to the fight is having an impact in Arizona and Michigan. What corporate responsible citizenship needs to look like in this moment where the very right to vote is under attack and Black voters in particular are being targeted, and Asian American voters dealing with an uptick in hate crimes, they are being targeted in these bills, which encourage racial profiling through their support of mass challenges. We need corporate actors to speak up against these bills in the states, support the voting provisions in federal bills like For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and then put their money instead of behind conspiracy theorists and Republicans who are forwarding the voter fraud lie, take that money and instead put it behind voting rights groups and groups out there getting photo ID for the some 200,000 Georgians who don't have photo ID. And a photo ID isn't free when you've got to pay for the documentation to produce, when you've got to find transportation around the county. So if you go to stopjimcrow2.com, you see plainly our call on corporate actors. And so we are grateful that Major League Baseball has spoken up. We are sad that they're not coming to our state, but grateful they're in this fight. And the only person to blame on this is Republican legislators and the governor. Stacey Abrams told the truth about this bill, unlike Brian Kemp, who is lying about what this bill is. And they are celebrating the loss of $100 million while they continue not to take action for their own people in a state that is suffering under poor leadership in this pandemic. And so this is a sad, sad month for the state of Georgia, that this is what their leaders are doing and blaming other people. And it could not become more cynical that these same folks are doing it to get the political hit and do a round on Fox News and raise money and celebrate the quote unquote good politics of supporting voter suppression bills to revive a moribund political actor, Governor Kemp, who is failing his fellow Georgians in a pandemic response so profoundly. And so that cynicism needs to be pushed back hard. And we will continue to fight for our Georgians and fight for voters, just like we did, spending millions of dollars in voter education to make sure Georgians could navigate the hours-long lines, make sure that so many advocates, many of whom on this call, were able to deliver water and snacks, make sure that if they got a provisional ballot, they knew how to cure that provisional ballot. So many of us and our ecosystem of tremendous voting rights group are the story on how we had the successes to have their voices heard. And that's what this bill is pushing back against. They saw how successful. And remember, long lines are one of the top ways to suppress the vote. And many of these bills are going to lengthen lines. And that's what they're seeking to do. And that's what they are celebrating. I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Seth, who's going to make some final comments, and we'll be able to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, James and Nancy. I am going to share my screen because one of the questions that is asked of us as voting rights experts is what is Brian Kemp talking about when he says that the bill expands voting access? And so we wanted to take a look at that. And I'm going to share my screen 1 second. Okay, so this so-called expansion of voting access, what it really is saying is that 1 day of early voting was provided for 40% of Georgia voters, and I'll get into why that is. But 100% of Georgia voters have their access restricted in a multitude of other ways that Lauren and James and Nancy highlighted. Nearly 60% of Georgia voters will see no expansion of weekend voting, and that's because 60% of Georgia voters live in counties that already have 2 Saturdays of early voting. So they will go from 2 Saturdays of early voting to 2 Saturdays of early voting. That's 60% of Georgians. Most Democratic voters and most voters of color happen to live and be part of that 60%, happen to live in those counties. No expansion of weekend voting opportunities, not a single minute of additional access for most Democratic voters, most voters of color in the state. Fulton, Gwinnett, Cobb, DeKalb, Muskogee, Chatham, they all already have 2 days of Saturday voting. And under this so-called expansion, they will continue to have 2 days of Saturday voting. Joe Biden won 56% of the vote in the counties that will see no expansion of access. But in Republican-dominated counties, weekend voting will expand. Counties including Cherokee, Hall, Walker, Columbia, and Houston, to name a few. Donald Trump won 59% of the vote in these counties, where Saturday voting is going from the 1 required Saturday to the 2 Saturdays. He won 102 of the 123 counties that are seeing this expansion that is only comprised for 40% of Georgia voters. So while they did themselves an electoral favor and gave themselves a talking point that many of you heard at Saturday's press conference from Brian Kemp, they can't pretend like this was some major expansion of voting opportunities in the state, because it was not. And I'll be happy to provide this information, these stats, to reporters as you wish. I'll stop sharing my screen, and now we will happily take questions. If your question is directed toward anyone in particular, please say so. The way that you can get in the queue is to click at the bottom, click participants. And when you click participants, you'll see a raise hand function, and you'll be able to raise your hand, and it looks like we're beginning to have questions. So again, you click participants at the bottom and then raise hand on the right-hand side of your screen. Okay, our first question will be from WABE's Emil Moffatt. You are unmuted and can ask your question.
All right, thanks, Seth. Question for Lauren. Third-party groups who sent out absentee ballot applications in last year's elections, now they have to comply with these new policies under SB 202. How much time and money do you think these new provisions will cost to groups like yours?
Thanks for the question, Emil. So this bill also changes the absentee ballot process by requiring the driver's license to be written on the form, even though you need to produce and have identification to get registered. So it's another barrier to vote by mail. So between that and the application new rules, we expect that all the organizations who have done that work in the past will have to spend additional funds to be able to do the same amount of outreach work. And I think this is really important topic because, as you well know, Emil and all, is there was a sea change in vote by mail. It started in 2018 in the Abrams campaign and expanded dramatically, which is, in 2018, Stacey Abrams beat Brian Kemp by about 50,000 votes in vote by mail. It didn't get the national attention that the Biden margins in vote by mail versus Trump, but it had started in 2018, and Kemp and his team are very aware that vote by mail, which used to be completely dominated, which used to be huge Republican margins, has now become a huge Democratic margin in 2018 and then in 2020. That dramatically expanded even further. And so these technical changes to absentee ballot applications, they're still permitting third party to send them out. Republican campaigns do that as well. And Republican organizations and right-wing conservative organizations also encourage their voters to vote by mail. Took them a minute to start doing that in Georgia, but they are now doing it. And so they're banking on that their voters are going to be able to jump through those hoops, and they're just creating more burden on advocates and pro-voter groups and Democratic campaigns and others doing that work. So that their hope, I believe, is to increase rejection rates and to cost groups more money. But at the end of the day, they're looking at margins. This is why the Heritage Foundation and other groups have these slates of recommendations. because they are brass tack looking at numbers. And so when you're looking at margins between 11,000, 90,000 votes, 55,000 in 2018, you know, you can kick people out of vote by mail through to technical errors on their forms, you know, kick provisional ballots out. All of those numbers will disproportionately, in each of those categories, are going to disproportionately impact voters of color and more Democratic leaning groups. And so on the vote by mail piece as well, our estimation, there are about 75,000 Georgians who voted in the period outside of the new timelines. So the new vote by mail restriction in 202 shortens the timeline on both sides on when you can both request an application, you have to request it later, and you have to return it much earlier. 75,000 Georgians, predominantly Democratic voters, requested and voted early or late. So those are big numbers. So when you stack it up between restrictions on absentee ballot application forms, having to write your driver's license number on it or produce a photo, shortening the period for requesting and returning ballots, and cutting out of precinct provisional voting, all four of those together are cutting into the margins of Democratic votes. And Republicans understand that because they know the state is now competitive. And same thing on the runoff restriction. There's been a lot of political chatter that David Perdue and others have had that if they would have had a shorter runoff period, they have theories that they would have won. We still would have kicked their behinds, okay? Democrats still would have won. John Ossoff would still be US Senator, trust me. But that impacts, there's 1.3 million Georgians who voted in the Senate runoff out of that time frame. So all of these are gonna, you know, we can send folks who are interested in these numbers, we can send them to you. The point is they're just nipping and cutting every little place in ways that are gonna disproportionately impact voters of color.
Okay, and again, if you have a question, you can click participants at the bottom and then raise hand on the right. Our next question comes from Stanley Dunlap of the Georgia Recorder.
And this is open to anyone who'd like to answer it, but my question is, what concerns do you have about the new local election takeover provision? And is there too much ambiguity about how to determine if a local board is underperforming?
I can take that to start. That is the most concerning provision of all of this. All of the various provisions of 202 is concerning, but this is the most concerning because this is an attempt to take over local boards of election. And there have been analysis that says this won't take impact for 2 years or 3 years. And the reality is, under this legislation, the clock is already ticking, right? And this will impact those counties in which Seth mentioned include about 60% of all Georgia voters. Those are the county boards of elections that the Georgia General Assembly is looking at to try to coerce into somehow forcing them to not certify these elections. And the reason why we know this, and I would also like to mention that there has been, writings that suggest that folks who are making these commentaries have not looked at or read the bill, nor were participating in these hearings, when in fact, many of us were literally at every single hearing, looked at every single piece of legislation, and know the context of which this is being discussed. In those hearings, they were very clear about who they are targeting here. It's on the record, Fulton County, among others. And so when we talk about how this will impact the certification process or how this will impact whether or not election results are challenged, the members who are pushing this literally signed onto lawsuits that would overturn the election results if they were granted relief. Like, we have to realize that they literally signed onto lawsuits that sought to overturn elections. So we're not just somehow using hyperbole or making, speculative assumptions. We're literally repeating what they said they wanted to do. This is where that comes from. And so that is the most concerning, because then that disenfranchises all Georgia voters. Because if a voter says, I want this candidate or that candidate, and they have the majority, that should be the candidate. It should be a question of, well, this person isn't supposed to vote or that person is not supposed to vote. That's why we call it Jim Crow 2.0, because that is exactly the standard that was used in the 1950s and the 1960s to disenfranchise Black voters. And we're going to continue to stand against that too.
Lauren or Nancy, did you have any thoughts on the takeover provisions? Okay, go ahead and move to the next question. And again, if you do have a question, want to get in the queue, click participants at the bottom and then raise hand at the bottom left. Our next question will come from Zach Montalaro from Politico. Zach, your line is unmuted. You can ask your question.
Hey guys, thank you for doing this. I just wanted to ask about kind of a two-part question about Major League Baseball's decision make the MLB's decision to leave, and then what role the national Democrats kind of play in this, because President Biden, encouraged Major League Baseball to move in. So what role do national Democrats have in this boycott decision making?
Look, a couple of things. First, Fair Fight Action, we are grateful that Major League Baseball took a look at these issues and spoke up loudly and made their opinion very clear that they're not going to stand for voter suppression, targeting voters and Americans of color on the heels of an insurrection and based on a lie by the same people, as President Woodall said, who sought to overturn the election results. Of course, we wish they would still come to our state and use that power when they were here as well, but we understand that people are gonna have to make tough decisions here. And so that's why on StopJimCrow2.com, we lay out clearly our call to action for everybody, including corporations that need to be on the right side of our small d democratic norms in a time when they are under attack. And we need them to get in the game now on pushing back and voicing their opposition to these voter suppression bills around the country. This is a national strategy. Georgia just went first, and the Georgia version of it, particularly strategic and precise in their targeting of voters. And corporations need to speak up and support the voting provisions in the For the People Act and support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We need federal action. It's very clear that Congress has a duty to protect Black Americans' right to vote. And it's their time. They need to step up, and corporations need to clearly voice their support for democratic norms. And a political party that chooses to move a slate of bills to restrict and change voting laws after an election they just lost is very clearly an authoritarian type move. You can look at this recent history and history of the world on when you try to change the rules of the game after you lose an election. This is a very serious threat to our democracy, and corporations need to understand that and get educated. And third and final, instead of putting money to PAC contributions to candidates that supported the insurrection and to support the lie of voter fraud that's undermining our democracy, instead corporations should use those funds to support the NAACP and SPLC and great nonpartisan groups that are working to defend our voting rights, are working to litigate these issues, and organizations working to get photo ID for folks. So that's our call to action. The final point, part of your question, Zach, on national Democrats. We're talking to a lot of folks, and they are extremely concerned. And on the politics of it, I think the Republicans in this racist overreach that all the experts who study the history of voting in this country very clearly say, yes, this is a new Jim Crow for the reasons James and others have outlined. It is absolutely creating the demand for federal action. And so this is educating members of Congress, many of whom don't live in states that are seeing these attacks. And so we are helping get them educated, because the For the People Act would make these voter challenge laws in Georgia null and void. There's very clear language in For the People Act that prevents what's called voter caging, these challenge laws. There's very clear language of the For the People Act around the ID requirements. So we need the For the People Act And we need the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would put a state like Georgia back under federal oversight and look at any new law and say not what the intent is. The intent's real clear here, but what the impact is. And that's why I started this call talking about provisional ballots. The impact of these new provisional ballot laws is going to disenfranchise Black voters, period, disproportionately. And so if the Voting Rights Act hadn't been gutted by the Supreme Court and Georgia had to pre-clear that, it'd be a pretty compelling argument for the Department of Justice to step in and deny Georgia the right to pass SB 202, or to implement it rather. So we're having those conversations left and right, and I know the Biden team, many leaders in Congress in both chambers are really understanding and getting their arms around these state bills and why federal action on federal elections is so important, so that we protect our democratic norms, protect our democracy. And so we're thrilled that they are paying close attention to the state legislation, and we're excited that For the People Act and others are going to be really moving through the legislative process this spring.
Nancy or James, did you want to add any points? Okay, we'll move to our next question. And again, if you'd like to get in the queue, click participants at the bottom and then raise hand at the bottom right. So again, Emil Moffatt from WABE, allow me to unmute your line.
Seth, before
Yeah.
Emil goes, I want
Yeah.
to look up. There's currently a campaign underway led by the AME Church, Black Voters Matter, and so many other amazing groups. And I'd just be remiss if we didn't mention them and the work they're doing around corporate accountability, mainly because one of the things that we're looking for, we're not calling for boycotts. What we're calling for is our corporate community to stand with the people and demand that democracy be preserved. Because the reality is this: whenever there are partisan ideals that take precedent over the franchise of the voting process, is when democracy begins to fail. And so that is why we're calling on the corporate accountability structure to be implemented. And that's why it's so urgent, because this cannot happen. Like we've said, we've seen hundreds upon hundreds of bills introduced across the nation. And with the work that the Black Voters Matter and the AME Church and so many other organizations like ours are doing, this is what democracy looks like. And we're going to continue to use every avenue that we can to protect the right to vote.
Thank you, James. Emil, you can ask your question.
Yeah, this question's for anybody on the call. What portions of this lawsuit are most ripe for legal challenges in your opinion, and what's the timeline looking ahead to 2022 if these challenges will be able to be made and by the time the midterm elections?
Well, I'll take that one because I know Nancy, you as well. We filed a lawsuit the Sunday after it was signed, and we challenged almost every single provision of it, saying that this is in direct contest to Section 1 or the First Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment on the basis of intentional racial discrimination. And so to Lauren's point, a lot of the provisions are surgical racism, right? They're looking at the margins, looking at the numbers and seeing how Black and brown voters are participating in the process and attacking every single franchise of the democratic process. And so from the provisional ballots to line warming to the runoff period to vote by mail, like we sent out absentee ballots to almost every single Georgian who participated. Now we are having an additional burden placed upon our organization's ability to mobilize our community. You look at provisions that talk about absentee voting. You look at folks who are currently incarcerated at local county jails that now have an additional barrier that's placed upon them for being able to participate. And if they want to participate, then now what they have to do is what would constitute as a poll tax, because they have to pay somebody to help them get their driver's license or a identifying number or those kinds of things. And so we're looking at every single provision in this legislation. Granted, it's 90 plus pages of a bill that was just maybe 2 weeks ago, 2 pages. And so we're looking at every single page, and that's what we lifted up in our lawsuit.
Nancy, you're still on mute.
I think you need to unmute her for her.
Oh, I can do that.
Okay, thank you.
There
Yeah,
you go,
because
Nancy.
thank you, Seth, because I actually did have some comments to make earlier, but I'll try to wrap them all. Number one, in response to your question, Emil, we believe that all of our claims are right. We brought one similar, although we've tried to include extended allegations in terms of the true burden. We believe that our claims are right because the law or the jurisprudence as it's been developing is not about allowing voters to be burdened and then challenge that burden. It's about recognizing that there will be a burden and trying to stop it in its tracks. I also want to recognize that, again, although our suit has been brought on behalf of organizations that engage in the nonpartisan space when it comes to voter registration and education, we are not ignorant or naive to the reality that partisanship often is a proxy for race. And we know how Black voters in Georgia and a lot of voters of color have been voting in terms of the political party with which they feel most affiliated with. And that is because I believe in part because of the responsiveness from certain elected officials as opposed to others. There is no question that Governor Kemp and those legislators in the Georgia legislature that signed on to this bill received the outcry, the huge public outcry in opposition to this bill, and they went ahead and passed it and signed it anyway. And that is the reason why, as Lauren indicated, we need federal oversight over Georgia, because the current governing structure absolutely cannot be trusted to have the interests of voters, all voters, at the heart of its work. And so again, we believe our claims are right, that this lawsuit was absolutely necessary, along with the ones that have been brought by the NAACP and others. We look forward to joining forces and working together in a united front to block this bill from enforcement. But we also want to lay the groundwork and legislative record for why, again, federal intervention and oversight are absolutely critical.
And while we're talking about lawsuits, Emil and others may know that in the Fair Fight Action suit we filed in late 2018 and amended and filed in 2019, that our co-plaintiffs are Ebenezer Baptist Church and the AME Georgia District as well, including some other faith plaintiffs. That nonpartisan suit just made it through summary judgment and will likely be in a trial later this year. And one piece of relief we're seeking in that suit, and this is just based on the 2018 evidence we presented to the court, is that we would be bailed back into preclearance. After the Shelby decision in 2013, the only two ways that a state could become covered again would be that either Congress acts, so that would be through H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, or that the courts required it. And so that is going to be happening later this year, while SBLC, NAACP, and other suits are going on this SB 202 issue. And so I think if there's any lack of clarity for Congress, for companies trying to figure out how to get in the game, there is racism in elections. That day is not over. The Shelby decision was wrong, and that there needs to be federal oversight and intervention in Georgia elections. And we need our members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, to be honest about that and to pass these federal bills. And so this whole year is going to be full of courtroom drama, as well as this federal fight at the same time. And so that's where I'm hopeful that through all of these different strategies coming together, that by the time we're in 2022, we will have mitigated additional further voter suppression in Georgia, and that we will again see historic turnout and the voice of the people will be heard.
All right, thank you all. Seeing no additional questions, we will go ahead and wrap up. Thank you for joining. Thank you to our speakers. Please feel free to follow up with each of our organizations with any questions that you may have, and hope that you have a good rest of your Monday. Thank you all so much.